There's all these constraints on reproduction and on starting a family that to a large extent are beyond the control of the individual, right? Yeah. So when we get into the sort of cause, men putting on particular kinds of underwear is not really going to do anything about that. It's so bizarre.
Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson, registered dietitian and Make America Healthy Again scholar. Returning to the show is sociologist and assistant professor Eoin Flaherty from Maynooth University in Ireland. Eoin first joined the show last month to talk about 5G, COVID, and what makes someone vulnerable to conspiracies. Today, we talk about pronatalism, eugenics, fertility, birth rates, and we get into climate justice and the environmental connections to population growth. He also shares the research he's working on now, and I talk about how it might be of use to the Make America Healthy Again evangelists. For this episode on pronatalism and fertility, I sent Eoin a video from internet doctor Paul Saladino.
This is crazy. Polyester underwear decreases or completely eliminates sperm production in dogs. But you know what's even crazier, guys? This has actually been studied in humans. There are multiple studies, 2 studies in human males where they wore polyester scrotal slings for 12 months. Completely stopped sperm production in one study and significantly decreased sperm production in the other study. This is wild. So my question to you guys is, if you care about the health of your sperm, or you care about the health of our species as humans, why in the world are you still wearing polyester underwear?
I'll get back to fact-checking that clip and everything Captain Cotton Underpants left out in my upcoming regrifting episode about him. This is not the first episode that has discussed pronatalism. In a Make America Healthy Again episode last fall, Alison Pill and I talked about Elon wanting a certain group of people to have more babies.
If you just want me to have another baby because I'm white, I don't know that that's a reason to go on ahead with that.
Right. And in context,
I think a lot of the fear mongering that's been happening in terms of population and like the pronatalist movement and everything else is absolutely part of that in terms of not being able to reimagine an immigration system that if we need more people because we're worried about our population taking a dive, there's a lot of people who want to come here. You know, where I'm like, I don't know that we need to be worried about, but we do because white women aren't having enough babies. As
right.
Always.
1000%. That's fantastic. Today, Eoin and I discussed Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's 1914 article titled Relation of Public Health to Race Degeneracy, which reads as a call to action to address the, quote, remarkable depreciation in racial vitality and stamina, end quote. And Kellogg shares his concerns that, quote, the human race, at least the civilized portion of it, has been degenerating at a rapid rate, end quote. Note that in this episode, Eoin and I will be using historical terms for people, including referring to populations of people as stock. We also talk about how bodies, particularly those that can grow children, are often discussed and used by society. We mentioned Adriana Smith, a 30-year-old nurse and mother in Georgia who was 9 weeks pregnant on February 19th when she was declared brain dead. She's been kept on life support because Georgia's new law restricts abortion once cardiac activity is detected and gives personhood rights to a fetus. It also allows for a fetus to be claimed as a dependent on tax forms. Stay tuned to the end of this conversation to hear about Eoin's current research and why I think he will soon be getting an email from RFK Jr. or someone else on his team. Eoin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for coming on a second time. I reached out to you after Trump was announcing all of these awards and monetary opportunities for women who were having, 4, 6 plus children. As you had mentioned, some population, interest in population. And I am just wondering what you think about what is going on in the US via population growth.
I think it's so interesting because it speaks to so many different parts of how society works, how social policies work. And I think what's really interesting about this period is that they're borrowing stuff from history, I suppose, that's been trialed before in various cases, usually with terrible, terrible consequences. And things that the world, not just the US, but the world has decided, okay, we've tried that. We now recognize it for what it was. A lot of population control policies, particularly in the US, were appallingly racist and have been abandoned, not for lack of evidence. We've got plenty of good evidence about the harm they cause, and are now suddenly back on the agenda. And I think this couldn't have happened in any other context but a Trump presidency, because you can also see how a lot of this feeds into and is supported by the position that Trump takes on many different things, particularly things like DEI. We might get to that in a little while. So, and again, the idea that you would sort of link, I guess, the good of the country with reproduction is a very old idea, of course, but one that we last came across in Europe probably in the 1940s. But then other countries have trialed, policies like this as well in different ways, like China's one-child policy. Other countries have repealed abortion laws, enacted abortion laws. We've been able to observe countries over the 20th century as they liberalized access to birth control. And so we can tell, quite easily what the effects of different, not just population control, but fertility control measures can have. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. We know what promotes equality, and we know what worsens inequality. So when we approach like Trump's interpretation of population control policies, today we do that with almost a century's worth of evidence that it's very much heading in the wrong direction. The consequences of it will probably be dire, and it's probably not going to work, to be quite honest. He's dealing with a force that I think is beyond social control.
So how would you link the restriction of abortion here and the Elon wants us to have more babies policies? How do you think they all connect and further a similar agenda?
For me, that exposes one of the biggest contradictions of this whole thing. If we just take the restriction on abortion, it's often been said, and it's always very clear, that I guess the evangelical interpretation of abortion or opposition to abortion is one based on a belief in the fundamental right of the child, which they define as something that happens at a very, very early stage of conception. And if you look at, I suppose, the history of church-run charitable institutions, what happens after the birth is usually pretty bad. And the level of concern, I suppose, that many institutions would have with what happens to a child after birth is relatively light. So I suppose not to paint this as a general religious problem, but among certain fundamentalists, certainly, the view is very much, a child at any cost, and then what happens afterwards is really up to the individual. So it's this idea that, the group has a collective responsibility to ensure the child is born at any cost. And then afterwards, that's not a collective issue. That's an individual issue. Go and work harder, go get a job.
Right.
And then the other thing I would say is that how does that sit within the idea of, pronatalism or paternalism? Is, yes, in the past, eugenicists were concerned with birth, and were concerned with, not just the rates of birth, but the quality of humans that were produced. I'm going to use these terms. I'm going to use their own terms just for a moment. And obviously these are terms we wouldn't use today.
Sure.
And so, it's interesting. We talked about the Kellogg article a while ago. And Kellogg is one of these big sort of figures in the early eugenics movement around the turn of the century. And if you read that paper, he actually mentions some really interesting things. At the very end of the paper, he actually says that the solution to the degradation of the races is actually public health. He says we should bring everyone under a public health. That's great. That's fantastic. But who are you talking about? Okay, let's get into that. So when they talk about, I guess, birth and I suppose the quality of children and that, they're really talking about a particular kind of child and a particular kind of family. And in the eugenics movement, that's often middle to upper class, wealthy, white, and what they would call sort of a negative discrimination against families, particularly the poor, and particularly people, when you get into it, they talk about families with a history of mental illness, of genetic illnesses, things like Marfan syndrome, for example, which causes hereditary cardiac issues. So they're very clear on the type of people that they're talking about. So it's not a concern. Same with abortion. It's not a universal concern with the quality of the population. It's a concern with a very particular branch of the population, which is very much rooted in notions of race and racism. And I guess the sort of natural basis of human ability, seeing different races as superior in that.
Yes. So with the abortion piece, I get confused. The often used statistic is that Black and brown people, poor people are having more abortions. And with the restriction of abortion, it doesn't square up with what kind of people we want to have here.
Yeah.
That it doesn't match for me. I'm like, wouldn't you want people to be having abortions if the overwhelming majority are not white people, are not like the proper stock of white people? It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know.
It confuses me too, to be honest. And I think the whole thing is riven with contradictions. I'm not certain that the people who think along these lines either are thinking consciously about the contradictory nature of it.
Fair.
But I think, one thing to think about is, and this will go back to Roe versus Wade, is that, when we look at the sort of the reasons underpinning abortion, even in the pre-Roe era, it was very apparent that women who had the means to procure abortion would travel to do so.
Right.
So that these sort of state-level restrictions on abortion merely resulted in people going out of state, usually under unsafe conditions, alone without family supports, to access abortion in another state. Ireland, where I'm calling it from, actually took a very similar stance in the 90s. And one of the first kind of measures they made to deregulate abortion access was about allowing women to travel to other jurisdictions. And that started a very long process of women going to England to procure abortions up until... And where we are now, we have repealed our constitutional prohibition on abortion, but it's still not there yet in terms of provision and access. So if you look at the reasons behind it, they're largely socioeconomic reasons. It's not this idea of a question of choice or moral failings. There are very clear structural reasons why abortion rates are higher amongst certain categories and classes of people than others. And it was really interesting to me looking at the character, I think, of Trump's policies, because in a way what it's doing is it's making it a racial issue without explicitly saying race. And I think that's what's unique about the modern application or what Trump is proposing in the modern application of population control, is that in the past, people would name very clearly, and they would name and describe that what we're talking about is a racial issue. You look at Germany in the 1940s, the same thing. They're talking very clearly about superior races, identifying who those races are. And here we come to 2025 with Trump, who enacts these policies that he knows are going to sort of rest upon and exacerbate existing inequalities, right? If you incentivize people to have more children, then you have to ask yourself, what category of the population is best placed to bear the burden, if you want to call it that, of having multiple and more children? So it's a policy that's implicitly going to reward predominantly white people for having more children, those already in a position of financial security, in a country where welfare provision around this, particularly postnatal maternal health and child supports and things like that, are relatively low. So when you break it down and project it forward, it's kind of satisfying the racial component of this without ever saying the word race.
Yeah.
So it's coming along in this context of gross inequality. So I would see them as very much the same thing, but couched in very, very different rhetoric and very, very different language.
No, I think that's super helpful. Thanks for that. You were mentioning Kellogg earlier in the early 1900s. One of my favorite fun facts is like the gatherings where people would win awards and such for having like the best bread, best babies. Is there any context you have for that? Yeah,
I think in the literature that those people produced, the prominent eugenicists, they distinguish between what they call positive and negative population control measures.
Yeah.
So like at the sharp end, the negative population control measures are things like controlling access to birth control, forced sterilization, which of course there's a history of that in the US as well.
Yes.
So those are the sort of the negative measures. And then the positive measures are the propaganda end, which is about the display of the ideal family. And in that sense, I haven't read a whole lot about it, but there's been a number of good studies. Medical historians have looked at these competitions, which were run in many states' fairs in the early 1900s. And they've concluded that a lot of that, really was about satisfying the positive population control measure through propaganda. So displaying to the public, and again, these things were picked up quite a lot by the media. Magazines like Better Homes, they sort of like home life-based magazines of the time would platform these competitions, and they would report on them So they weren't just limited to, the spectators. There was a lot of publicity around them at the time.
Yeah.
But they also developed, in the course of carrying those out, one paper I was able to find actually talks about, it's fascinating, about how they actually decided what made a good baby. And they would score them out of 1,000. So, first of all, it was kids about 6 to 48 months.
Okay.
They'd measure their weight, their height, they'd look at their chest circumference.
Oh.
And then in a typical case, they would look at mental acuity. So they would do some interaction exercises with like a nurse. And, they'd be given a score. But they could only score 100 for physical and 200 for mental. The rest of that, the 700, was about physical appearance.
Yeah.
So that was about having an ideal physique and absence of sort of visible defects and things like that. So actually the majority of the measurement was quite subjective. They took the physical measurements and then the rest of it was based on, I suppose, their version of what an ideal body was. Of course, we all know the basis of the ideal body in Western civilization is usually white people.
Definitely.
So again, the whole thing was engineered with all of these racial connotations. Incidentally, a lot of these things do, survive in some capacity today. In a very different way. These kind of reality shows about fittest people and fittest families and kind of fitness competitions and that.
From what you're saying, or with the judging that you're talking about right now, it really makes me think about the trying to assess IQ and everything else from embryos and then choosing those ones to implant. What do you think about the decision about IQ in an embryo?
I think we could start with the IQ first of all, because there's a lot of controversy and I think a lot of consensus now that capturing capacity, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, with a single figure is not possible. And interestingly, that's a debate that was started by the first eugenicists. A lot of the early statisticians, people like Ronald Fisher, Carl Pearson, were very supportive of the idea that you could sort of distill human capability into a single measure. They would argue sometimes maybe it should be 2, maybe it should be 1. But to cut a long story short, we end up in the 20th century with this measure of IQ, the intelligence quotient. And one of the big debates in the late 20th century was about the connection between biology and IQ and genetics. And I think a lot of this culminated in 1994. There was a book called The Bell Curve, which was a monumental study that tried to link. First of all, what they tried to do was demonstrate racial differences, ethnic differences in IQ. So they used a number of measures. One controversial measure, which was actually it was kind of I don't know what you call it. It was like a military aptitude test. It was like a battery of questions. And in the book, they present these differences in IQ. And one of the cases they make is that we've gone from a situation where your life chances and your outcomes are determined by your family background or your starting class position to one where your outcomes are determined by your intelligence. And this was a hugely controversial study. And one of the first things that critics took up with this in the mid-90s was about the measures or the adequacy of the measures. And ever since then, there's been a steady drift towards a consensus that, first of all, there's multiple errors with the study, but really key amongst them is the idea of measurement. And that your intelligence, first of all, despite the fact that it can't be captured by a single figure, human capacity is determined by so many different things. And there's really, as a sociologist, we tend to go straight for the nurture, right? But there's fascinating work coming on in epigenetics, for example. So I suppose the model we would lean towards is one of a combination of factors, environmental, social, biological, genetic. But in this paper, in this book, they make this case really that it's yes, there's environmental factors, but, controlling for these, still intelligence is the prime determinant. So when we get to the embryonic stage, we're kind of approaching that from the point of view where we know that, intelligence is a life course thing. It's something that develops and evolves in different social contexts.
Okay.
It happens through family, through peer networks, through schools, college, work. And all of these things shape your capacities, your personality. They shape who you become. So once you get down to the question of whether we can sort of extrapolate out from, fetal testing, there's very, very limited evidence for that, I would suggest. Where you do tend to get controversies like this arising, and this actually came up in the Irish campaign for repeal of the 8th Amendment for the legalization of abortion. There was a case presented by pro-life or what we called anti-choice campaigners who said that if we enact abortion, it will lead to the situation where people will seek genetic testing in advance to test for things like Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. And they ran these, really horrific ads with pictures on them saying, that this could disappear and this would be the end of that. And then, one of the great things about the repeal campaign was that, spokespeople for organizations representing families and people with Down syndrome came out and said, this is abhorrent, of course. And, there was a massive public backlash against it.
Okay.
So, I would say, well, yes, we know, of course, it is certainly possible to detect for these kinds of conditions. When we talk about intelligence, that's another thing entirely.
When I did the regrifting episode on Andrew Huberman, one of his girlfriends, the primary, we'll say, girlfriend, he was perhaps going to have children with her. And in the blow up of the relationship, one of the allegations was like, we had, prepared to do IVF. We were a real couple. And his spokespeople came back and said, no, they weren't going to have children. They created embryos. And there seems to be this fascination with embryos, maybe from a, biotech, bioscience perspective that seems very new and very weird. And I wonder where it comes from. I don't know.
I would only really know, I think, about the legal kind of the controversy end of it. I don't really know a lot about where that might have come from. But it's not a very common thing to happen as far as I know. Certainly in countries without universal healthcare, I think it's quite an expensive measure to go through. A lot of these fertility treatments are.
Yeah. I feel like it's just a product of the manosphere. Like, I am choosing the best of my stock. I don't know. It all seems very weird and gross across the board.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was over the course of the last 2 years, the controversies that Elon Musk has been involved in where, the outcome seems to be determined by just the flexing of financial might, which I think says a lot about the inherent rights of different people and that, your rights will be vindicated as long as you have the money to do so. And, that just seems like such a perverse situation to be in.
Why do you think folks are getting in such a twist about having and needing more babies?
Gosh, I think, demography has always been a concern of governments. If we look to the East, first of all, countries like Japan, we've known for a very, very long time that Japan has a very particular kind of demographic catastrophe coming, which is the birth rate has fallen below replacement and has been for a very, very long time. So in the imminent future, Japan is facing a scenario where they've got a very large amount of older people and a small amount of younger people. And that's not just a problem from the point of view of like funding the welfare state and, tax revenue and that. It's also a question of elder care. If we look at China as well in particular, a lot of the elder care systems there are quite residual. The responsibility lies within the family. And of course, China experimented in the 60s, 70s and 80s with one of the longest running, I suppose, population control procedures, which is the one-child policy.
Yeah.
But I think that going back to the US, there's a whole storm of conditions coming together here, which makes it particularly interesting. And I think one is economic. I think, first of all, it's important to say that what's built into economic growth models is the assumption that there will always be an expanding pool of not just consumers, but also labor. So from the point of view of forecasting, a projection that shows a slowdown or a reduction in population growth is essentially incompatible with future continued economic growth.
Interesting.
And that's a really big problem because every economy in the world at this point, I think it's fair to say, bases its policy decisions on creating a scenario of future growth. And it's why recession is so damaging and disastrous, right? If a country slips into negative growth, its economy isn't growing, it enters recession, and that has all sorts of implications and ramifications for national well-being, I suppose. So if you look at that in the context of the US, and if you look at this, I suppose, the general trend over the last couple of years, which is about the falling total fertility rate, I would imagine that that's ringing alarm bells amongst financiers, amongst social policy analysts, because essentially that poses a threat to one of the key components of future growth. Right? If you don't have an expanding population, then you enter the situation where, on the one hand, if people are having less kids, you expose yourself to the problem that Japan is having, where you've got this huge age dependency ratio, lots of older people, lots of young people. But it's also really bad for finance, it's bad for investment, and it's bad for the economy in general because, you're removing that key component in the economic growth engine, which is about population. But I mean, then there's some other things as well that sort of come into the mix. And one, I think, I suppose a smaller one, but no less significant, would be the fallout from COVID, where ideas like the Great Replacement kind of took on a bit of currency. And we're seeing ideas like this now pop up in Ireland in particular, the far right, which is on the rise in Ireland at the moment. One of the things, I suppose, in their stock or their inventory is this idea of the Great Replacement, that immigration is actually part of a controlled plot to replace the indigenous, whatever that means, Irish population with immigrants and with foreigners. And this is an idea that sort of but it started to gain a lot more traction during COVID, while people were looking around. And again, you harbor these kinds of ideas. You're looking around saying, oh, now my movement is restricted. Now I'm being forced to take a vaccine. I suppose they form part of that climate of ideas that people take on, and that's how they come to see the world. And I think to some extent you could link the currency that these ideas have today with the notion of the Great Replacement. And suddenly here we are in the US, we've got falling population. And if you look within the birth rates, right, birth rates for white people within the US are low. Birth rates for black people are slightly higher.
Right.
For Hispanic people are higher again. And then the highest is amongst Hawaiians, as far as I know, Native Hawaiians. So you have this scenario as well where, well, it's not really a secular concern with population alone, is it? It's about this racial difference between reproduction rates, right? Or fertility rates. And then you also have this geopolitical element, which is at the moment, Africa is experiencing a baby boom at the moment. They're predicting that by 2050, I think it is, Lagos could be one of the most populous cities in the world.
Interesting.
And also, if we look at the central role that China has now taken in US politics, China is very much seen as a competitor, and rightly so. I mean, the economic boom that China has experienced in the last 20 years is unprecedented globally. But at the tail end of that, I suppose, a number of years ago, they dropped the one-child policy as well. So you have this return to this kind of reversal of the conditions that many would say actually formed part of the Chinese economic boom, right? Which was about sort of what they would call positive population control. Now, there were all sorts of negative side effects from that, of course. But I think if you look at the way the US is approaching, even with the tariffs, the way the US is looking at China as a competitor, I think population plays a role here as well, because no doubt they're looking at the dynamics of population change in Africa and China, putting that in the context of the slowdown in the US total fertility rate and thinking, well, into the future, 20, 30 years, we're going to have problems. Now, I'm not saying that's a problem, but that's probably the way they're thinking, I'd imagine.
2 follow-up questions. We're using birth rate and fertility. Do you see a difference here?
Oh, sorry, the measures, yeah. So there's a couple of ways that they would measure it. The birth rate is usually expressed in births per thousand.
Right.
So that would just be sort of a count per thousand people. And then the total fertility rate is like the average number of kids. So this would be like if the total fertility rate is 1.2, then that would be like the average number of children per individual. And again, there's different definitions around this in family unit, not family unit. But sort of per individual who has a kid, then it would be, 1.2, 1.3. And then when they talk about fertility rates, they also talk about replacement level. So as long as the fertility rate is above replacement level, so that that basically more kids are arriving than people are dying, and you're maintaining the population at a stable level, then you're at or above replacement rate. So when they talk about a country being below replacement rate, that's when they start talking about this sort of crisis situation.
Interesting.
Or negative situation.
Fertility for me has always been like ability to have children, not as like a rate. And again, on the Bro podcast, there's a lot of discussion about male fertility and how it is going down, and making it seem like a big deal, even though it's like a very small percent of fertility specifically that is going down. And now I'm like, is that like sperm count, or is that like per person? I'm still, I guess, putting those pieces together. I sent you a very alarmist video from Dr. Paul Saladin.
Yeah.
Yes. It was like, stop wearing polyester underwear. It's going to make you, it's contributing to the decrease in fertility in men, et cetera, et cetera. And linking that directly, of course, like if we wear cotton, or if men wear cotton underwear, then they will, have the ability to be more fertile. So I assume that is like a sperm, like capacity, not a like fertility rate, but I don't know.
Yeah, I should say as well that in the literature, there's a lot of problems with these terminologies as well, like what we would understand. You're absolutely right. I mean, how we would use the term fertility is way different to what people would imagine fertility to be.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for whatever reason, historically, that sort of that TFR, that total fertility rate number, which is kind of like, I think in the 60s or 70s, they would have said, the family with 2.5 kids.
Yes.
Which is sort of, it's not like it's not a kid or it's not a pregnancy. It's basically, it's just a crude average where they take, total birth divided by the number of people, and get this figure, which is like 2.5.
Interesting.
And then they use all sorts of other numbers as well. But the bro thing is really interesting because last night my wife and I watched this show on Netflix about the Liver King.
Yes.
And one of the things he was doing or talking about, what he seemed to be doing a lot on the show was eating testicles.
Yes.
So we get, bull test. I think it was predominantly cow.
Mm-hmm.
And it just struck me when you said it there, it's a rare instance where they're actually bringing men's culpability into this discussion around fertility. It's usually quite the opposite. It's about blaming women.
Yeah.
When you get into the reasons behind it, all right, so if we just take, if we take this idea of a transition from high birth rates to low birth rates, which many countries have undergone, this is a really, for a long time, social scientists thought this was an inevitability, that every society that became modern would do so by going through this transition from high birth rates, high death rates to low birth rates, low death rates.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons behind this are, it's not entirely intentional as such. It's a social phenomenon, right? So it's about education, access to birth control, safe birth control. It's about delayed marriage. So it's about accession to the workforce. Women's participation in the workforce goes up quite a lot in the 70s, the 80s, 90s. Educational attainment in many sectors as well at the moment. If we just take medicine in Ireland, for example, there's almost pay parity between women and men. Now, it looks worse when we look at certain categories of job.
Okay.
Right. So if we look at, say, elite specialisms, there's still disparities there. But if we look at within nurses, let's say it's, slightly better. So there's still a lot of things to be dealt with there.
Mm-hmm.
But when you put all those things together, along with rising inflation, rising cost of living, which again is the issue in Japan at the moment, the rational decision becomes, I'm not going to get married at 20 and start having kids. There's no social safety net.
Yeah.
We can't afford the rent. We can't buy a house. So what we also notice in tandem with falling fertility, falling birth rates, is a delay in the age of marriage and delays in the age of first birth.
Yeah.
So when you put all those things together, these are individual decisions, of course, but they occur in this context where there's all these constraints on reproduction and on starting a family that to a large extent are beyond the control of the individual, right? Yeah. So when we get into the sort of cause, men putting on particular kinds of underwear is not really going to do anything about that. It's so bizarre.
And for folks who are listening, our next regrifting episode is on that guy who runs around grocery stores yelling at people.
Excellent.
Yeah, he's great. He was like, stop eating peanut butter. Peanut butter is never healthy. Peanut butter is a seed oil. And I was like, sir. God. It's wild. Yeah, solving the problem with cotton underwear, but also bringing men into the conversation is interesting.
I mean, the other thing to say is across the world, I mean, this has been an issue that people have been writing about with regard to Africa for a long time. For example, about when we talk about poverty alleviation, and one of the things they always talk about is about education and about access to birth control and reproductive autonomy. And that's really the central issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's interesting when you put that in a context where effectively the Trump administration is rolling back on all of these different social safety nets, you've created a condition where it's largely impossible or difficult for people to exact, true reproductive autonomy. The idea being that even if someone did want to start a family younger, they couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. And those policies, again, are going to disproportionately affect people already in poverty and low income. And I think, as I said before, you put that in the context of pronatalism, right? You're really talking about a particular class and a particular category and a particular race of people. So for me, it's incredibly insidious. It's a policy that achieves essentially a racist outcome without really explicitly mentioning race. So they've managed to kind of engineer this context where, by pulling a few strings here in policy terms, their projection is that they'll end up with a desirable scenario, their own scenario, which is an increase in births, of course.
Yeah.
Without ever having explicitly mentioned race. They can sort of depend on people acknowledging that undertone, I suppose.
And I think of Black women, Indigenous women, and maternal and infant mortality rates. Like, the more likely, or the more times a Black woman or Indigenous women need to have children, the more likely they are to die. But and the autonomy and the Black women intersection here. You and I were talking before we started recording about the woman in Georgia who is brain dead, but who doctors are requiring her to carry her child. Well, could we even say that her body is being used as like an incubator, or what would an appropriate word be for that?
I don't even know if there is an appropriate word. It's
there
just
you are.
Horrific.
It's not even an abortion because it's not a baby, or it wasn't 9 weeks. Anyhow, infuriating, disgusting, no autonomy there, no deference to family, but just, the ways that Black women's bodies are treated. It's like,
there's so many parallels with the Irish case as well. It really struck me reading it this morning, just how similar the two timelines are. I mean, I guess the first big event here, sorry to call it an event, but I guess the first incident in the timeline in the period leading up to repeal in Ireland was the death of Savita Halappanavar, who was admitted to hospital with sepsis and who was undergoing miscarriage. Now, she was treated appallingly in the hospital, right? There's been inquiries about multiple failings around this, but the famous, I think, line that people remember from that time was that when she requested a termination, she was told no, and it was said to her by the nurse that this is a Catholic country, and we can't do it here.
Right.
Now, she died afterwards, I think a number of days later after being on high dependency life support. But 2 years later, I think it was the Christmas 2014, possibly 2015, there was another case with a person who's not been named, as far as I know, who again became pregnant and experienced a traumatic brain injury and was effectively kept on life support for almost 2 weeks because the doctors felt that one of the real problems in Ireland prior to repeal was that doctors had no clear interpretation of what the actual constitutional provisions meant, like what would happen to them or the family if they provided termination.
Oh.
So they were stuck in this limbo situation for about 2 weeks while the High Court deliberated. Now, ultimately, the termination was offered, but the girl had to be made a ward of court, and it was a really long, drawn-out process. And just the parallels to what's happening in the US at the moment are striking, because, the whole point of Roe versus Wade was about, taking away the capacity of the local judiciary to interpret abortion laws, right? So you didn't have the risk of someone, if it's enacted at the constitutional level, then you remove that risk of, I suppose, the local judiciary, making alternative. It was the same thing in Ireland. The whole point of the Eighth Amendment was about making it a constitutional issue so that you essentially deny the judiciary the chance to repeal that or to move against it. Was that the law clearly said that in the case of a heartbeat, you have a person essentially, and we can't make a decision on this without knowing what the legal position is or what the ramifications will be. So that was the rationale, at least.
Gotcha.
At the time.
And then is birth rate, fertility, and all of this like a uniquely capitalist problem? Because in my mind, like, if we don't have enough people, we have not treated this planet well in the first place. I don't think it deserves, we don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Is it a uniquely capitalist problem, or I don't know. Yeah,
I think there's a good answer for this if we go back a few hundred years. One of the most famous people in this debate about population growth and resources is Thomas Malthus. So at the end of the 18th century, Malthus writes this essay called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And I tell my students every year, I say it's no exaggeration to say the influence that this essay has had is still very much with us today in the room, informing the design of our welfare systems, unemployment supports, everything. So in the early 19th century, Malthus is writing and saying that inevitably humanity will reach a point, if population growth goes on unchecked, that we'll reach a point where there's an excess of population over food supply. Mm-hmm. And he makes this argument kind of mathematically. He says, if we look at the way populations grow, they grow exponentially. So it's multiplicative. So you've got this sort of growth curve that starts and then takes off really, really quickly. Mm-hmm. And then he said, but if you look in the natural world, food reproduces in a linear fashion. So he has this plot where he shows like this sort of kind of 45-degree line of food supply going up, and eventually the population growth passes the food line. And he says at this point we have a catastrophe. Now he also had all these other kind of allied ideas about poverty and about whether we should, help people in poverty, whether there should be social welfare programs. And in the end he concluded no, because if you don't have poverty, then you don't have any motivation to industry.
Right.
And we see the same thing amongst eugenicists as well. It's about supporting, the best of the stock, but we shouldn't be facilitating or enabling the inferior classes and races to reproduce. So it's the same kind of rhetoric. Yeah. And so Malthus is hugely influential. And again, when this comes out, the dominant ideas then at the time become, and then of course Darwin publishes Origin of the Species in mid-19th century. And then we get later on people like Herbert Spencer comes up with the idea of survival of the fittest. That was him, it wasn't Darwin, and applies that to population. Okay. So we've all these ideas that, the world is driven by natural laws, and, how could it be otherwise? If population continues unchecked, then we'll inevitably find ourselves in this scenario of, disaster where we'll run out of food. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest critics of this in the 19th century was Karl Marx. And this gets back to your question about whether it's universal. He says that, well, actually, no, this is something that's very specific to a capitalist economy. Okay. Because you can't have a capitalist economy depends on having a large supply of low wage labor. Yes. Right. So capitalism doesn't like when there's a minority of labor, for example, because then labor is powerful. They can make demands like pay me more, give me more leave, or I'm going to go and work elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So Marx replies to Malthus and he says, well, actually, this is not the case. He says, this is very specific to this point in time. Britain is generally writing about industrial Britain and the societies of Western Europe. And he's saying, we've industrialized, all of this change has come along really quickly. And actually, this is something that's quite unique historically. Okay. That in past societies, we don't have, you do find this occasionally and in places, but it's not a universal law. Now, whether it's true or not of past societies, he's able to say that it's not an inevitability that we're doomed to social collapse if the population keeps growing. Okay. It's about the distribution of resources. Mm-hmm. And those ideas of Malthus are still there today very much in the way that I would say most capitalist governments think about social welfare. Got it. That we can't provide generous benefits because it's going to inhibit people's industriousness. Mm-hmm. Or if we keep them in this sort of conditional kind of state of semi-poverty, it'll motivate them to do better. Sure. And that's a very, very dominant idea today. And even like societies like the Nordics, Finland, Norway, Sweden, who historically have had the most effective welfare systems, they're now taking a turn the other way towards more residual services. So again, these ideas are hugely influential. So when we come to the question of, I guess, can the planet sustain a population? In the 1970s, people believed not. Mm-hmm. And they believe this largely on a number of things. I mean, one of the most important was the publication by Meadows and others in 1972 of the limits to growth, which I mentioned at the start. And this was this sort of landmark computer simulation-based report that showed this is what happens if population continues to grow unchecked. And they came up with a number of different scenarios, and essentially the narrative was that we're heading towards crisis. Now, when we look at how this translates into social policy, in the 1980s and 1990s, it becomes a conversation about fertility control in Africa and other countries. It's not about the responsibility of the global north. It's a question of poorer countries with higher fertility rates. And then in the 1960s, late 1960s, an ecologist called Garrett Hardin writes a paper where he comes up with this concept called the tragedy of the commons. And one of the great quotes from this is, freedom to breed will bring ruin to all. And it says, without strong intervention from governments, from the state, whatever you want to call it, without controls on how we exploit, how we manage our natural resources, then we're doomed. Humans can't be trusted to do things on their own. So we need this kind of heavy hand of the state to regulate us to ensure that we don't slip into a place of disaster. Mm-hmm. And it's a very pessimistic view on human nature. It's almost like, humans can't be trusted on their own. And actually, a lot of research since then has shown, well, actually, if we go back, in time, 900, 800 years, there's tons of examples contrary to this where people have worked together, developed their own rules, developed these fantastically, productive ecosystems that are still in place today in some instances.
Mm-hmm. So
this kind of time period is a time of big debate about, whether doom is inevitable, what's the natural tendency of humans? If we're not governed by a strong authoritarian state, are we simply doomed? And the position that social scientists end up at is, no, not really. We have plenty to go around. The problem is that, we exist in a society that doesn't enable that distribution. I think what's happening in Palestine right now is a great example, a terrible example of this, right? Because you have the scenario where we're talking about essentially mass starvation next to one of the most developed and advanced economies in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Amartya Sen wrote about this in the 1980s. I said, every modern famine has occurred in the context of global food security. So there's food. The problem is supply. So it's never a scenario today where, a country is simply past this point of like Malthusian excess. We have the technology and the ability to get food where it needs to go. And if it's not getting there, then it's a political choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's a human choice.
Right.
So examples like this really confront this idea, I think, about the inevitability of ruin.
Mm-hmm. In the US, I am just thinking and wondering how much of the urging to have children intersects with our supposed goals for immigration enforcement and having more US born folks rather than actually letting people who want to come here. And I don't know, I'm thinking about that. And something else that you said earlier with the better breeding of the 1900s, there was a discussion about the racial degeneracy in white folks. Yes. And what you said reminded me about how there has to be a lower class or else like upper class / white people don't get to feel good about themselves, and maybe think about and wonder about that as well. I don't know.
I mean, to go to the first one, I think it's true to say that the US, like many other advanced capitalist economies, depends to a large extent on immigrant labor. And other countries, I guess, would have had these debates earlier on, say Britain in the 1990s or 1980s. In the 1980s and 90s, Britain was already in this place where it was starting to notice sort of shortfalls in labor and things like its care sector.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing in Ireland in the the late 90s, early 90s. And we get to today, Britain is in a place where it is now confronting, I think, a threat from the far right. People like, Nigel Farage is now a member of parliament.
Right.
They've got a couple of councillors, and they've got people active in, I suppose, these anti-immigration movements who have quite a long and checkered history with more violent organizations in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And this is happening at a time where now it's worse. I mean, the shortfall in labor in sectors like medicine and care in Britain is quite severe.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they can't function without continued immigration. The argument was made at the start of the second Trump term as well. I mean, the same thing, that you've got massive employment in low-wage sectors. A lot of work as well, of course, continues off the books. I mean, there's lots of undocumented migrants in the US, and famously in cities like New York and Boston, there's a very large undocumented Irish population.
Oh.
And these are people that work. My colleague at the moment in Maynooth, Darian Gandia, is doing great research on this amongst undocumented Irish in New York City. It's kind of a state of legal limbo. I mean, there were moves made by Obama, kind of by Biden, overtures, let's say, that the Irish vote has always been important to the Democrats, about sort of providing a pathway for those people to naturalize. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it's just one case that shows, at every step, in every city, every state, there is immigrant labor, possibly undocumented immigrant labor, and it's central to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question is about, does society need an underclass?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is a huge debate in sociology as well. I mean, historically, the answer has been presented in slightly kinder ways as yes, you do, for whatever reason. So, I mean, the most benign way that people have talked about it is from the point of view of a division of labor. So our society functions on a combination of highly complex tasks and what would be called, I don't like using the term low skill, but a lot of the ways we measure these things, they use terms like low skill.
Right.
So the question is usually put as this inevitability that you're going to have a large amount of positions that need to be filled that have a lower skill requirement than others. So, and this is often used as kind of a false argument to say that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. There's always going to be low wage work. It's just the way the world is set up. And I think it's kind of a false premise as well. When people talk about social change in this regard, they don't necessarily mean eliminating inequality. They mean sort of compressing that difference a little bit. So if we look at the state of inequality in Ireland, the UK, the US today, I mean, if we look at top income inequality, right, just the top 1%.
Yes.
The last time the US had this level of top income inequality was on the eve of the Great Depression in the 1920s. So the UK as well have done this full circle, and after the Second World War, the US brought down inequality quite a lot. The New Deal programs, all of that.
Yeah.
Pulled inequality down to an historic low, and then in the 80s, Reagan and Thatcher came along, and it starts to climb back up, and it keeps going. So, I mean, the most sort of sensible arguments I think that get discussed in the public domain are ones about, say, you imagine a company where the CEO earns, I don't know, 30 billion a year, let's say, just put a fictional figure on it.
Yep.
Which is, but 80% of the workforce is, assembly line workers who earn minimum wage with no benefits. You could comfortably redistribute income at the top from the CEO down through to the workers.
Yes.
Without really touching the material quality of life of the person. So great is the difference between the billions that accrue to that person and the dollars that accrue to the person at the bottom. So some arguments say, yes, of course, there'll always be a division of labor, but does it really have to be this unequal? You could have a scenario where, you raise the income floor of the lowest workers and you limit, and this is an idea that's been piloted and kind of voluntarily enacted in some companies, which is where the income of the top earning person can't be 7 times more or 11 times more than that of the bottom earner. Now, the problem with that kind of voluntarist policy is that very few companies take it up. I mean, Richard Branson's Virgin company, famously, I think about 10 years ago, he said he was going to allow employees to take as much leave as they wanted. Did they take more leave? Not really, because, the work climate kind of takes care of itself there. And also necessity. I mean, if it's unpaid vacation, I'm not sure if it was in the case of Virgin. I presume some of it was unpaid. Then you're not going to take that decision, right? So, so the debate usually falls between those two stools. On the one hand, people saying it's inevitable, you can't do anything about poverty, sort of backed up by, social theorists and economists who would say that actually poverty is a good thing. In many economic scenarios, poverty is great because it provides the spur to industry. Beyonce said we all have the same 24 hours in the day. If you want to be wealthy, then get out of bed and work hard, this kind of thing. And the other side is about, the fact that we know we can make real change, and it's not really a question of, eliminating the division of labor in society, of eliminating low wage tasks completely. It's about redistribution. And incidentally as well, just to come back to the climate question, I mean, that's where a lot of the debate on climate policy is at the moment. I mean, if you just say Oxfam did a report in 2020, and what they did was they looked at total greenhouse gas emissions over 30 years. They looked at 1990 all the way up to, I think it was 2019. And they did some calculations, and they said, if we just take the top 10%, if we look at the emissions of the top 10%, so the 10% wealthiest people in the world, they're responsible for 50% of those total emissions over the last 30 years. And so the consensus now in the climate justice spaces is, unless we actually address that, unless we address the overconsumption of the wealthy, their capacity to escape regulation, fining, things like that don't work. Unless we do that, we're really just stabbing in the dark. You got to start with inequality.
Something else that I found is when it comes to climate, it isn't necessarily the number of people that is going to negatively impact the climate. It's the amount of consumers, and perhaps creating more consumers. Is that something that you found as well?
Definitely, yeah. I think industries like fast fashion are a great example of this. I mean, first of all, just the environmental input in terms of water and in terms of raw materials that goes into manufacturing garments in the first place is incredible. But the thing about fast fashion is that it's not, the fast part of that is about the speed up in sort of trends and turnaround time. So, in the classic kind of fashion scenario, you might have had 3-4 seasons per year. Now, thanks to social media, you've got a turnover in trends that operates on the space of weeks, and you can access those. Yeah. Right. So if something is trending, you can access the item, you can order it quickly, you can have it quickly, and then you can throw it away in 2 weeks' time when the next one comes along. And now the problem that arises from that, and this is a general feature of climate change as well, is the question of where does all that waste go? It ends up in places like the Atacama Desert, in mountains of synthetic fiber garbage in Chile, which is, from a biodegradability point of view, it's horrible. It ends up in places like Ghana, where it's sold by the bale, sold at markets, and the rest just goes to landfill. But the point is that, the big inequality there is a global inequality. So in the global north, in high-income countries, we reap the benefits of buying the garment, wearing it. We experience none of the environmental consequences of this. We ship them off somewhere else, so they go elsewhere. Now, we have the capacity from a consumption point of view to change this. Right? So again, without reducing the number of people, we could reduce the amount of stuff that we buy. And the difference that would make, I think, and the fast fashion industry as well, the requirements for this, wood, fibers, water, chemicals, chemicals as part of the production process as well, dyes and things like that.
Yeah.
We could make a very substantial dent in that by just addressing that one industry. And the other one would be things like AI. So
yes.
At the moment, we're in a very difficult situation in Ireland. Ireland is, or has become, a global haven for data centers.
Really?
Yeah. Companies are scrambling to Ireland to open data centers. Part of it is climatic. We don't have a lot of climate variation. We stay at a pretty low, so you don't have to super cool them, and we don't get many hot days. The other one is regulation. We don't have a good history of regulating multinationals, let alone taxing them. But the problem is that those data centers draw on the national grid, and our current statistics show that they take about 21%. 21% of our total energy production is just going to data centers.
Wow.
And if we look at the planning permissions that have been granted for future ones, by 2030, it'll be about 30%. Now, what's happened there is that in wintertime about 2 years ago, the grid was in danger of falling below capacity. So there was a risk that in the winter months, people were heating their homes, demand for energy goes up, there's less light. So we actually had to investigate recommissioning an old oil-fired, I think either an oil or coal-fired power plant.
Yeah.
Which is really sad because the state effectively shut down its entire peat industry over a prolonged period of time. And, measures like this about, facilitating data centers and that, that excess capacity, some of it's going to come from renewables. Yes, but also it's just creating an undue burden. If you remove that 20% burden, we could probably reach our domestic capacity quite easily through renewables and gas. A lot of our electricity comes from gas-fired plants as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not a numbers question. It's a consumption, and not just the number of consumers, but how we consume and what we consume. So, there are key sectors there and key industries where we could make a very big difference quite quickly, I think.
What other connections do you have between climate, environment, climate justice, and pronatalism?
That's an interesting one. I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. There are, if you read the IPCC reports, and so the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's an international panel of experts that convenes I think it's about a 5 to 6 year cycle where they collate and they report on current state of evidence on climate change. So what's happening, how bad is it, how has it changed, and how have our future projections updated on the basis of that new information. And in that, there's a lot of stuff in there. Yes, they do talk a little bit about population, but one of the things they talk about more is about what they call adaptive capacity. So this is the idea that, if we look at, increases in temperatures, rising sea levels, whatever, one of the consequences of that is that you get a very uneven experience of disasters. We're starting to see this at the moment, right? We've got, flooding events across the world, wildfires, of course, that California is quite familiar with, 2016, I think, or 2017, kind of around the center of kind of Santa Rosa area, just north of San Francisco. And then, of course, more recently had the LA wildfires as well. Different parts of the world. So Sydney, a number of years ago, experienced record rainfall. Kenya experienced incredibly severe outbreak of locusts. After heavy rainfall, the locust population boomed, and they're very big, they're very hungry, they eat a lot of crops.
Wow.
So you've got all of these different kind of side effects happening in a very uneven way across the world. But one thing we do know is that the burden is going to fall very much on poorer countries, low-income countries, particularly women, who in low-income countries do a lot of the domestic labor as well. We know that it's disproportionately going to affect that. So there's all these different dimensions that affect what the IPCC calls adaptive capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you might have, say, flooding experienced in a high-income country, a low-income country, but the capacity of a low-income country to adapt to that is going to be much lower, right? The resources available to do that or to address that are going to be much less than they would be in the global north. So they don't talk explicitly about kind of population as a factor necessarily. The narrative now really is about the uneven impact of these different things.
Okay.
And I guess it's the growing recognition that more can be achieved and that a bigger impact will be made by addressing things like, let's say, food production, about addressing, emissions in the food production chain, particularly meat production.
Okay.
About land use regulation, about regulating deforestation, about reining in polluting industries,
mm-hmm.
about shutting down fossil fuel production. There's oil there, just leave it there. There's gas there, leave it, leave it in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the discussion is. And yes, of course, there's talk about population and projections, but largely from the point of view of how that's going to affect, I guess, future needs. I know there are people that still say it. I mean, Prince William was made a statement a couple of years ago where he talked explicitly about the need to reduce population or because of population control. I can find it and send it on to you if you want, but it's still something that pops up time and again amongst, prominent individuals, politicians. So it's still there on the radar. It still hasn't really gone away.
Something that I'm thinking about when it comes to climate change is the LA wildfires specifically, and the previous early 2020s overall California wildfires and the climate anxiety it created for many of us. But most recently with the LA fires, the levels of toxic metals in the soil with folks who are rebuilding their homes, the regulations were to just dig out the first 6 inches of, soil, and then assuming that is safe then to build houses upon. Turns out, of course, that is not the case. Lead in drinking waters for children. And I'm wondering if, as climate disasters are impacting richer people, if folks will actually start paying attention. But I don't know that to be the case at all.
I think that's where I would land, in my opinion. I think until it becomes more visibly impactful, it's going to be difficult, because essentially what you're asking people to do if you're talking about climate justice, you're asking people, particularly people in high-income countries, to do less.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is about saying that, we could ask, everyone globally needs to achieve net zero in this particular point in time. But that creates the problem that you've got low-income countries who essentially are playing catch-up in technological terms, industrial terms. So there's very much a recognition that what's actually needed is not everyone gets the same targets.
Mm-hmm.
It's that advanced countries, high-income countries, reduce their consumption more to give space for those countries to, whatever you want to call it, develop.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we're all on, in an ideal world, on the same level playing field, then we all reduce at the same rate.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about, degrowth policies, for example, about slowing and reducing economic growth, there's a recognition now that you need to be clear about which countries you're talking about. Gotcha. Because you're going to do more harm, compound the existing inequalities in low-income countries if you do that, if you enact that as a mandate.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, my personal opinion is, if you think about things like fuel taxes or carbon taxes, a lot of the measures that we use to address climate change are very individual.
Mm-hmm.
So they focus on individual consumption.
Yeah.
Now, in some countries, this has worked really well, like Norway. The electric vehicle uptake rate in Norway, I think about 80-something%. I think it's 88% of vehicles in Norway at the moment are electric. And they've done this through some really incredible measures, like saying, every time you do a public procurement for a car, so let's say a state department or a politician wants a car, that has to be an electric car.
Mm-hmm.
They've undergone these massive incentives, not just things like tax rebates, but direct incentives around switching to electric and upgrading the electrical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are examples, I suppose, where you can individualize it like that, but it takes a colossal collective effort to do that. The other side of that then is the other kind of individual measure, which is where you punish the individual in the same way. So you punish the wealthy individual, you punish the low-income individual, right? So let's say you put a tax on fuel. As a proportion of your income to a low-income person, that's going to be a lot, but the wealthy person isn't going to feel it, and it's certainly not going to register as a nudge effect, as economists will call it, in terms of convincing them to change their behavior.
Sure.
So there's all kinds of problems with, I guess, the kinds of measures that we take as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. As you were talking about fast fashion, I thought the conversation around fast fashion I have heard often is that we shouldn't be so hard on people, I'll say Americans, who are getting garments to, keep up with those who are able to buy the more expensive ones, like blaming individuals for like this problem rather than addressing a problem generally about fashion. I don't know what it is. The idea that we can't get mad at people for choosing inexpensive clothes when, we're say competing with or in somehow compared to folks with the means to buy more expensive clothing, and how both of those things are fully missing the mark, maybe.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think it would be a mistake as well to see this as just a modern sort of thing. I always say to my students, I say, look, if you can seek a sustainable alternative, that's fine. But I mean, if we just look at the US, I mean, if you look at the growth of like low cost retail outlets like Walmart over the 20th century, a large part of the low wage story in the US is about the fact that, low cost retail made it possible for people to live on less, and to a certain extent, wage levels track with that.
Yeah.
So you can't blame individuals for buying cheaper stuff, of course. And I always say to them, look, if you can make a more sustainable decision, do, but you shouldn't be hard on yourself if you find yourself in a situation where you can't.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So fast fashion is one of these really complicated and thorny problems where, it's satisfying a very real need amongst people.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say a need that's been created and sustained as well by social media. And you follow that trail, a lot of it leads back to large corporations and producers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would look at that from a very balanced point of view, I think, in terms of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all have the capacity to turn off social media, but we exist in an environment where it's very difficult to do that.
Right.
And we shouldn't punish or blame the individual for that.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other side of it is, if you remove the market for it, then, one of the most effective demonstrations, I guess, against the company is a collapse in the market, if there's a mass boycott. And, in the past, boycotts like that have worked. There was a global, I suppose, organized boycott in the 80s against, and this was particularly strong in Ireland, against handling produce from apartheid South Africa.
Yes.
Incredibly effective.
Yeah.
And it's not even the case that you reduce their sales to the point where it hurts them economically, but it plays a very important symbolic role, and that matters too. So if you get prominent people on board, let's go back to fast fashion. Let's say that, they come out against this. Yes, on the one hand, that's a good thing, but what do you do about the people who, can't afford clothing and depend on fast fashion outlets to?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of these really kind of thorny issues where there's a huge degree of corporate culpability, but it's not really clear to me what the pathway is to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have patients who live in San Francisco who leave the city to go to the dollar stores in the less affluent neighborhoods, and who don't have cars, who have to figure out a way, right, to get to that dollar store because it's too many buses or however it is. And we've never really addressed the problem. It makes me think about charity for food, and all of these cute little Band-Aids where people can feel good about themselves, but never actually addressing a problem.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing now as well with those sectors too.
Yes. Well, yeah, because a lot of them are not being funded anymore. Yay, because it's going great over here.
Oh, I don't know. Things are going pretty... No, I will give you you can have that award, but...
For the worst.
I think even 2 years ago I would have said we're immune to it. I don't think so anymore, to be honest. There was a big far right demonstration in Dublin about 2 weeks ago. Got about 10,000 people, which is big. I mean, for Ireland, that's quite big.
That'd be big for here too. And
then, but that happened after. I don't know if you saw this, but the Irish Prime Minister went to the White House on St. Patrick's Day.
No.
And then 2 days later, Conor McGregor met with Trump in the White House. So McGregor has come back to Ireland, where he is universally hated. I find it very difficult to find an Irish person that supports Conor McGregor, where he's sort of become this kind of figurehead spokesperson for the far-right movement. I mean, it remains to be seen what the long-term effect of that will be, but it's becoming a bit more organized. It's starting to look a bit more like a movement than a rebel.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bit of work to be done there.
Yes. Before we jump off, do you want to tell folks what you're working on now, where your research is headed?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah. So at the moment, so I'm doing a few things. I'm finishing off a book with my PhD supervisor, which is a guy called Eoin Slater.
Mm-hmm.
And this book is kind of based on the notebooks of Karl Marx from the later part of his life, where he wrote a lot about Ireland. Okay. And we've been very interested actually to read those and interpret those, because for a sociologist, it tells us a lot about one of the kind of seminal people in the founding of sociology, thought about ideas like revolution and ecology as well. Marx wrote a lot about the Irish famine and the responsibility for the Irish famine and that. So that's one thing we're trying to finish.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose day to day, what I work a lot with is geographical data. So we've been looking at a few things. We've been looking at the changing, I guess, religious demography of Northern Ireland, which is about this sort of growth that we've seen in recent years of the Catholic percentage of the Catholic population,
mm-hmm.
which is a big deal because we're sort of inching towards, I think, a vote for Irish unification in the next 10 to 15 years.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of that is going to rest on the demography of Northern Ireland, the share of not just Catholics, Protestants, but I suppose ethnically what those people identify as, whether it's nationalist or unionist. And then within that, in the last census in 2021, we discovered they asked a question on autism. They usually, and when you fill out your census form, there's a list of disabilities you can tick. It's not to say autism is universally a disability, but the way they categorize. So it's in there. It's one item along with things like, high blood pressure, heart disease. So we actually have a count, a population level from the census of the number of people identifying as having a diagnosis of autism or Asperger's. So they kept the term Asperger's in just to capture people who would have been diagnosed in the 80s and 90s before that term fell out of use. And that lets us do a lot of things. We can map it. We can, look at correlates of autism rates and try and see what are the characteristics of those areas with higher counts of diagnosis than others. And that's all, kind of blue sky stuff. There's not a lot of data to compare it against. So that's in the very early stages, but we hope to publish a short report pretty soon. Yes.
And do you expect people to take on that correlation as causation? And by people, I mean people in the US and the Make America Healthy Again, folks.
Possibly, yeah. And actually, one of the big changes I've noticed just writing over the last 10 years is that you have to be a lot more careful now, I think, with what you say and how you say it, especially as the soundbite out of context has become a thing. So I'm definitely thinking very carefully about how I write this up. And the other thing is, I guess it's quite there are lots of studies, I suppose, that have used individual and survey data to look at autism and sort of contextual factors, family factors, all of this. There's not a lot of geographical data on it. So this would be one of, I guess, certainly not the first, but it seems to me like one of the best examples of a case where a country has gathered systematically this information and we've got a whole population count. And that would let us do, I think, a number of things that we couldn't have, or explore a number of things that we couldn't have done before. So that's quite exciting. Yeah. Is there an inverse relationship to 5G? Just asking. Oh, God. Are you going to map autism and 5G? I know, yeah, that was the first podcast, actually. Yeah, we talked about this. There's definitely no shortage of people out there who believe it, which is, part of why you have to be so careful. Yeah. I think, especially when you get into talking about, even just pitching the idea of environmental factors, is a very dangerous term now, I think. Right. Like that's RFK's cause for literally everything. Except and it's a very, very difficult, it's one of the most difficult terms, I think, because, the reality is, scientists themselves rarely use the term cause. You're always very skeptical and hesitant about the notion of, especially with social phenomena. You can never tell really if something is truly causally related. You can eliminate competing explanations, kind of, but you can never conclusively say, this causes this. Like an example would be, the relationship between social class and long-term earnings. Where it's a really strong relationship. We know it exists. We have a fair idea why it happens, but it's not a physical material property of someone that you can measure clearly. You can ask people questions about their income. What do you do? What's your job?
Right.
To get a handle on social class, but you can plot that against their income. But, I think any scientist would be very careful about ever using the term cause. It's not something you see.
Let me tell you that scientists over here are happy to say that sugar causes diabetes. Let me tell you, they're very comfortable over here saying that for a bit in the 90s that eggs caused high cholesterol. So.
Okay. Yes, I remember hearing that over here too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's false. But, we believed it, and that butter was unhealthy and that we should eat margarine. Like, yeah, maybe it's just.
We had very big dairy propaganda in Ireland in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And Britain as well, because we watched a lot of British TV growing up. They ran this series of ads. It's a very famous ad. It's this kind of guy in this it's like a Tin Man costume. And he's telling everyone, the kids, to drink a pint of milk every day. It's like, or your bones won't grow. And there was all this stuff in the 90s about which it turned out, of course, was being funded by the dairy lobby.
Absolutely. It's great. I love capitalism. It's my favorite.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm looking for reasons to bring you back. And I think autism right now is a really important conversation to have. So I would love to have you back and talk about that one.
Yeah, I think if you give me a couple of months, I'll have something to say. I mean, I don't know a lot from the psychological side, but the sort of, environmental, spatial stuff, definitely I could say something about that.
Let's. Thank you in advance.
No, it'll take me a while to get to it because I probably won't get a clear run at it till probably mid-June. But I'm going to write up the short brief tomorrow, so I can send you that. You can have a look. It's going to go to the publishers hopefully tomorrow, but it's very short. It's like 2,000 words.
Thank you so much for coming back. I appreciate it.
Sure, anytime.
Thanks so much to Eoin for coming back on the show. I really look forward to his return and any updates. Next week's episode will be the re-release of How I Decided to Start This Podcast. I'll be heading back to UCSF's Trans Health Summit where 2 years ago, I was promoted to Arts and Crafts Director and will be bringing you updates from this year's conference in a future episode. The following week, you'll get to hear me and Trampus Harmon talk about Paul Saladino and how Saladino relies on his followers to not Google his citations and also not how to read beyond the headline. Trampus and I get into camel milk, Paul traveling with coconuts to drink the water on airplanes, and much more. Until next time, friends, keep making it awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. One way to support the show is by rating, reviewing, subscribing to it on your podcast platforms. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts and give me 5 stars. You can join the Patreon and become a more supportive member of this show. This show is edited and mixed by Jen Jacobs, who is of Peak Stock. It's supported by the legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services, who helped me fix Paul Saladino's video on peanut butter.
Nothing can make peanut butter healthy. Peanut butter is a total scam. So it's ground up peanuts, which are going to be oxidized and contain the peanut oil, which is the seed oil.